Yil Neth's 4 eyes narrowed, a tremor of genuine disbelief running through his chitinous frame. No competent military commander would divide their forces in such a manner, he stated, his voice a low, rumbling echo of his absolute certainty. He leaned forward, gesturing to the holographic display, the perfect Kthmore Tactical Formation 7 still suspended in mid-air, a testament to millennia of battlefield superiority. Such a tactic would be suicidal, leading to fragmented command, diluted firepower, and a swift, decisive defeat. It violates every fundamental principle of strategic engagement. He looked at Captain Santos, expecting to see a glimmer of understanding, perhaps even embarrassment, on her primitive human face. Instead, she simply nodded, a slow, thoughtful gesture that infuriated him more than any open defiance. Lieutenant Morrison, meanwhile, continued to grin, an expression Yil Neth was rapidly coming to associate with impending galactic-level headaches. Sergeant Walsh merely crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering, a silent challenge in her stance. The other alien cadets, who had initially chittered with suppressed laughter, were now unervingly quiet, their eyes darting between the human delegation and their esteemed commander. A ripple of unease, faint but perceptible, began to spread through the amphitheater. "Precisely," Captain Santos finally said, her voice calm, almost too calm. "It's tactically unsound for anyone expecting a competent military commander. But what about someone who isn't? Someone who doesn't care about your millennia-old principles? Someone who just wants to win, by any means necessary?" She took a step closer to the holographic display, her finger tracing the ethereal outline of the formation. "You've built a perfect machine, Commander. Flawless. Invincible. As long as the enemy plays by your rules." Yil Neth felt a cold knot form in his primary heart. "Our rules," he corrected, his voice sharper than he intended, "are based on universal principles of logic and efficiency. They are derived from countless conflicts, from the dawn of galactic civilization to the present day. To deviate from them is to invite chaos and destruction." "Chaos and destruction for whom?" Morrison chimed in, his grin never faltering. "Because from where we stand, chaos can be pretty effective. Especially if the other side is expecting order." The audaciousness of the statement was breathtaking. Yil Neth had dedicated his entire life, spanning centuries, to the Kthmore military doctrine. It was the bedrock of galactic peace, the iron fist that maintained order against rogue factions and nascent threats. To suggest it was anything less than perfect was an insult of cosmic proportions. He was about to launch into a scathing rebuttal, a detailed explanation of historical campaigns and strategic triumphs, when Sergeant Walsh spoke, her voice a low, gravelly counterpoint to Morrison's cheerful insolence. "Commander," she began, "you said your simulations have a 99.7% success rate. That's impressive. Truly. But that 0.3%? What happened there? And were those competent commanders on the other side, too?" The question hit Yil Neth like a physical blow. He had dismissed those failures, minuscule anomalies in an otherwise perfect system. They were attributed to unpredictable environmental factors, localized equipment malfunctions, or, in a few cases, a sudden, inexplicable shift in enemy behavior that had been quickly corrected and never repeated. They were not, he had assured himself, flaws in the doctrine itself. But now, under the unwavering gaze of these primitive humans, those anomalies suddenly felt significant, like tiny cracks in an otherwise impregnable fortress. He cleared his throat again, the grinding sound more pronounced this time. Those instances were outliers. Unforeseen variables that were subsequently integrated into our algorithms for future refinement. "So you did adjust your perfect doctrine for unexpected behavior?" Captain Santos asked, her eyebrow raising ever so slightly. It wasn't a confrontational question, more of an observation, but it carried the weight of a profound realization. "Doesn't that imply your universal principles aren't quite as universal as you believe?" The entire amphitheater seemed to hold its breath. Even the Zephyrian cadets, usually so stoic, shifted uncomfortably. The Torvin students stopped scribbling. Yil Neth felt a flush of heat rise beneath his chitin. Never, in all his years, had his authority, or the authority of the Kthmore doctrine, been so openly questioned, let alone by a species he considered to be barely advanced enough to operate a basic warp drive. Our principles are foundational, Yil Neth insisted, though his voice lacked its usual unshakable conviction. Adaptation is a sign of strength, of refinement, not weakness. Agreed, Morrison cut in, his grin now stretching from ear to ear. But if you only adapt after something unexpected happens, aren't you always a step behind? What if you could adapt before? What if you could make the enemy the one reacting to your chaos? He gestured wildly at the hologram. What if, instead of moving as one big, beautiful, predictable wall, you spread out? You become harder to hit. You become faster. You become less like a machine, and more like an organism. Something that can mutate and change shape mid-battle. The concept was anathema to Yil Neth. It was military heresy. The Kthmore doctrine emphasized unity, centralized command, and unwavering discipline. The idea of units acting independently, creating chaos on the battlefield, was horrifying. It went against the very core of their strategic philosophy, which revolved around overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. Such a method would be, in his deeply ingrained understanding, a recipe for disaster. That would invite insubordination, friendly fire incidents, and a complete breakdown of cohesion, Yil Neth countered, his voice rising slightly. It would be inefficient. It would be human. He spat the last word out as if it were a particularly vile venom. Captain Santos met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Maybe that's our strength, Commander, she said softly. Maybe inefficiency, in the right hands, can be a weapon. Maybe chaos, when wielded deliberately, can be the ultimate discipline. She paused, letting her words sink in. We call it the fog of war, Commander. And it's something we've learned to live with, to exploit, since our very first skirmishes on Earth. When you expect everything to be perfect, the smallest imperfection can shatter your resolve. But when you expect nothing but chaos, then every moment of order is a victory. And every moment of unexpected chaos from you, well, that's just business as usual for us. Yil Neth stared at the holographic formation, then at the confident, unapologetic faces of the humans. He had come to teach, to impart wisdom, to demonstrate the pinnacle of galactic military might. Instead, these primitives, with their simple questions and unsettling logic, had managed to sow a seed of doubt he hadn't known was possible. The Kthmore Tactical Formation 7, once the epitome of invincibility, now seemed rigid, predictable, and, for the first time in millennia, vulnerable. The silence in the amphitheater stretched, no longer one of respect, but of dawning, uncomfortable realization. The lesson had just begun, but Yil Neth suddenly felt like the student, and the universe, with its infinite variables, had just delivered a tactical surprise of its own. He had always believed that the answers to all strategic questions lay within the Kthmore doctrine. But these humans were asking questions he had never even considered. And the implications were terrifying. The heavy silence in the amphitheater was finally broken by Captain Santos. Commander Yil Neth, she said, her voice cutting through the tension with surprising clarity, if your doctrine is so robust, and our questions so primitive, then perhaps a practical demonstration is in order. Let's run a simulation. Your Formation 7, at its peak, against us. Yil Neth felt a surge of cold fury mixed with a perverse sense of relief. Finally, a chance to put these audacious humans in their place. A simulation, unlike a philosophical debate, had undeniable outcomes. He could crush their naive theories under the weight of proven, millennia-old strategy. A simulation, he echoed, a sneer barely contained in his voice. Are you truly suggesting a contest of arms, even a simulated one, between the pinnacle of galactic military strategy and your inefficiency? He gestured dismissively at the human trio. Very well. Let it be done. Though I warn you, Captain, you will regret this display of hubris. Lieutenant Morrison's grin widened. Hubris, Commander? Or maybe just curiosity. We're always eager to learn, even if it means teaching a few new tricks along the way. The challenge was accepted. Within moments, the amphitheater transformed. The holographic display expanded, encompassing the entire lecture pit, projecting a realistic battlefield simulation. Barren plains stretched to a distant, craggy mountain range, a typical neutral conflict zone used for advanced tactical exercises. Yil Neth, with a flick of his mandibles, activated the Kthmore Tactical Formation 7, a magnificent, intricate ballet of virtual warships, ground troops, and aerial support converging into the impenetrable wall he had boasted about. It was a sight of awe-inspiring power and perfect coordination. As you can see, Yil Neth announced, addressing the now completely silent cadets, this formation is designed for overwhelming force and absolute control. Every unit knows its role, its target, its next move. There is no waste, no hesitation. He turned to the humans. Your move, primitives. Captain Santos, however, didn't issue grand commands. She turned to Morrison and Walsh, exchanged a few rapid, almost whispered words, and then simply nodded. What followed was bewildering. Instead of forming a cohesive unit, the human forces, represented by generic, agile virtual avatars, scattered. Some sprinted directly towards the Kthmore formation, seemingly on a suicidal charge. Others peeled off, heading for the distant mountains, while a few surprisingly nimble aerial units darted low, almost skimming the ground. There was no apparent central command, no grand strategy discernible to Yil Neth's experienced eyes. It was, as they had boasted, pure chaos. What is this? Yil Neth scoffed. They are fragmenting their forces. They will be annihilated in detail. But the annihilation didn't come. The Kthmore formation, designed to meet a frontal, organized assault, found itself strangely off balance. The units charging directly at them were too few to pose a real threat, but their erratic movements forced the Kthmore front lines to break formation slightly to target them. As soon as a Kthmore unit committed to an attack, the human units would vanish, using cover, natural terrain, or simply their surprising speed to evade. Meanwhile, the human units that had gone wide began flanking movements, not attacking, but simply positioning themselves in unexpected locations, observing. They're not attacking, a Zephyrian cadet whispered, confusion in his crystalline eyes. They're running away? No, Captain Santos replied, her voice calm, a slight smile playing on her lips. They're exploring. They're making you react to them, Commander. Not the other way around. Yil Neth watched, a knot forming in his gut. His perfect Formation 7, designed to advance with relentless precision, was stuttering. Its advanced targeting systems, accustomed to predictable enemy movements and formations, were struggling to lock onto the constantly shifting, unorganized human units. When the Kthmore units did fire, their coordinated volleys, designed to obliterate large targets, were wasted on single, agile human avatars that had already moved. The human units, when they did engage, did so in small, irritating bursts, targeting vulnerable support structures or exposed flanks, then immediately disengaging. It was like trying to swat a swarm of hyperactive insects with a massive, slow-moving hammer. They are provoking us, Yil Neth growled, trying to maintain his composure. Trying to lure us into an ambush. Is it working? Sergeant Walsh asked blandly. It was. The Kthmore formation, built on the principle of unyielding advance, was losing momentum. Its units were increasingly spread out as they tried to chase down elusive human targets. The coordinated fire, the hallmark of Formation 7, was becoming fragmented. Communications channels, normally precise and streamlined, were cluttered with requests for target reacquisition and reports of unpredictable enemy behavior. The elegant ballet of destruction was devolving into a frustrated, disorganized chase. Yil Neth felt a cold dread creep into his heart. The humans weren't fighting his doctrine, they were ignoring it. And by ignoring it, they were exposing its fatal flaw, its absolute reliance on the enemy conforming to expectations. The first simulation ended, not in a Kthmore victory, but in a stalemate, a concept almost unheard of when facing Formation 7. The Kthmore forces, while still largely intact, were scattered, their cohesion broken, and their resources significantly depleted chasing phantoms. The human forces, though numerically inferior and seemingly disorganized, had suffered minimal losses, their chaos proving surprisingly effective in evasion and disruption. Remarkable, a Torvan student mumbled, their mechanical appendages whirring with interest. Their loss ratio is negligible. Despite their lack of conventional strategy. Yil Neth felt his chitin crawl with frustration. It was an anomaly, he declared, his voice louder than intended. A fluke. Their tactics are unsustainable against a determined foe. They rely on luck, not skill. Or perhaps, Commander, Captain Santos interjected calmly, they rely on something you haven't accounted for, the human element. Adaptability. Improvisation. And the willingness to do what isn't competent, but is, in fact, effective. They ran another simulation. And another. And another. Each time, the Kthmore Tactical Formation 7, the invincible doctrine of millennia, found itself flummoxed by the humans' unconventional approach. The humans never formed a neat line, never engaged in a head-on clash. They were fluid, unpredictable, always probing, always shifting. They would bait an attack, then retreat. They would appear where least expected, cause a localized disruption, and then vanish into the digital fog of war. They targeted supply lines that Kthmore doctrine deemed too secure to warrant heavy defense. They exploited communication blind spots that were considered insignificant in a perfectly synchronized formation. They even employed tactics that seemed designed purely to annoy and distract, forcing Kthmore units to waste precious energy and attention on minor threats. The alien cadets, initially amused, then confused, were now openly fascinated. They began to observe the humans with an intense, almost desperate curiosity. They saw Lieutenant Morrison laughing as his virtual units executed a seemingly suicidal dive to draw away a Kthmore heavy artillery unit. They saw Sergeant Walsh coolly directing a small group of avatars to repeatedly harass a Kthmore command center, preventing it from issuing clear orders. They saw Captain Santos, her eyes fixed on the holographic display, anticipating Kthmore reactions with an uncanny precision, guiding her chaotic forces with an invisible thread of intent. But, it's so messy, a young Valthwan cadet murmured, their tentacles writhing slowly. Our lessons teach us elegance, precision. Elegance doesn't win wars, kid, Morrison replied, overhearing. Winning does. And sometimes winning means getting messy. The debates within the academy faculty became heated. Younger instructors, who had been intrigued by the humans, cautiously raised questions about the rigidity of their own doctrine. Older, more entrenched commanders, like Yil Neth, dismissed the human performance as a novelty, a fluke that would be easily countered once their tricks were understood. But the simulations proved otherwise. Even when the Kthmore algorithms were adjusted to anticipate the human chaos, the humans would pivot, finding new, unexpected avenues of attack. It was like trying to catch smoke. Yil Neth felt his carefully constructed worldview crumbling around him. For centuries, he had taught that absolute control was the key to victory. These humans were demonstrating that absolute chaos, when wielded with intent, could be an equally potent, if not more devastating, force. He had always prided himself on his ability to analyze and predict. But the humans were unanalyzable, unpredictable. They were the ultimate unknown variable. One evening, after a particularly humiliating simulation defeat where the Kthmore formation was systematically dismantled by a fraction of its size, Yil Neth confronted Captain Santos. "You are not fighting fair," he accused, his voice raspy. "You deviate from established combat protocols. You do not engage directly. You undermine the very spirit of military confrontation. Captain Santos looked at him, her expression serious. Commander, fair is a luxury the losing side often can't afford. We fight to win. If your spirit of military confrontation means playing by rules that guarantee your victory, then we will break those rules. Our philosophy is simple: survival and victory. We don't care how pretty it looks on a tactical display, or how much it upsets established doctrine. We care about results. We learn from every mistake, every unexpected hit, and we adapt instantly. We don't have millennia of perfect doctrine to fall back on, we only have our wits, our ability to improvise, and our willingness to do the unthinkable. That, Commander, is the human element. Her words resonated, an unsettling truth that began to echo through the hallowed halls of the Kthmore Military Academy. The perfection of the Kthmore doctrine was being challenged, not by a superior force, but by a fundamentally different way of thinking. The human exchange program, initially a condescending joke, had rapidly transformed into a full-blown academic crisis for the Kthmore Military Academy. The constant simulations, always pitting the flawless Kthmore doctrine against the chaotic human approach, yielded increasingly disturbing results. It wasn't just that the humans were avoiding defeat, they were actively exposing profound vulnerabilities in a system once thought impenetrable. What truly confounded Yil Neth and his fellow instructors was the nature of the human success. It wasn't about superior technology or brute force. It was about something far more insidious: psychological warfare, improvisation, and a complete disregard for what was considered proper or logical military conduct. "Look at this," Lieutenant Morrison said during one post-simulation debrief, pointing at a segment of the holographic display. "Here, we sent a single, lightly armed recon unit directly at their main supply depot. It was a suicide run, obviously. But it pulled 3 heavy cruisers out of formation to chase it down. That is an inefficient use of resources on your part," a Torvan instructor countered, whirring indignantly. "A wasted unit for minimal gain." "Minimal gain?" Sergeant Walsh scoffed. Those 3 heavy cruisers were protecting the Kthmore Command flagship. For nearly a full cycle, the flagship was exposed. If this were real, we'd have had a strike team on it and been gone before they could react. She shrugged. "We lost 1 scout ship. They exposed their most valuable asset. Seems like a fair trade." The concept was alien. The Kthmore doctrine focused on optimal resource allocation, decisive engagements, and logical progression. The humans seemed to delight in illogical, almost irrational, moves if they created confusion or exploited a momentary weakness. They introduced noise into the perfect Kthmore system, not with weapons, but with unpredictable behavior. Their morale systems are unusual, a Zephyrian data analyst reported, studying the simulated human units. Even when heavily outnumbered, or facing certain destruction, their units do not register significant drops in will to fight. In fact, often, the more desperate the situation, the more erratic and, paradoxically, effective their movements become. Yil Neth felt a chill. The Kthmore doctrine had no counter for this. Their system relied on breaking enemy morale through overwhelming force and predictable attrition. What do you do when an enemy thrives on being pushed to the brink? Captain Santos explained it simply: "We don't fight machines, Commander. We fight living beings. And living beings, when cornered, don't always behave logically. Sometimes, they surprise you. Sometimes, they do the impossible. We've learned to cultivate that. To embrace the unseen variable of human will and desperation." The simulation started to become less about the raw destructive power of Formation 7 and more about its inherent rigidities. The humans would manipulate Kthmore forces into overcommitting, creating gaps in their lines. They would feign retreats to lure Kthmore units into advantageous terrain for the humans. They didn't seek to destroy the Kthmore formation head-on, they sought to unravel it, thread by thread, by making it respond to unpredictable stimuli. Yil Neth found himself watching the human movements with a growing, horrified understanding. His doctrine, so elegant and perfect, assumed a rational opponent. It assumed an enemy that sought to minimize casualties, that operated within established tactical frameworks. But the humans, they played by no rules but their own. They were the ultimate wild card. They were willing to lose beautifully by the metrics of conventional warfare, if it meant creating the chaos needed to win ugly in the brutal reality of conflict. He remembered a particularly devastating simulated engagement where a small human force, seemingly trapped, launched a desperate, uncoordinated attack on a Kthmore flank. It was quickly annihilated. But in the few moments of panic and disarray it caused, another, even smaller human unit, completely unnoticed, slipped past the main Kthmore lines and struck a critical, lightly defended communications hub, crippling the entire formation's ability to coordinate. By Kthmore metrics, the humans had suffered a decisive loss. But in practical terms, they had won the battle. The Kthmore commanders had always aimed for flawless execution, minimal losses, and undeniable statistical superiority. The humans aimed for victory, no matter the cost in conventional terms, no matter how messy or unconventional the path. This fundamental difference began to gnaw at the very foundations of Yil Neth's understanding of warfare. He had always believed that efficiency and perfection were synonymous with victory. The humans were demonstrating that sometimes, the opposite was true. The unseen variable wasn't a new weapon or a secret technology, it was the unpredictable, chaotic, and utterly human spirit of defiance. It was a realization that would shake the very core of galactic military doctrine.